Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Peter Bergen, the author of The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. He's written several books on terrorism, the American response to terrorism, and indeed on Osama bin Laden himself, who he met and interviewed in 1997. He's also the director of the International Security Program at New America. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Bergen.
Thank you for having me on.
Before we start the interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. You describe in this book, Peter, if I may, what it was like in 1997 to be blindfolded, driven through the mountains of Afghanistan, and brought into a room where Osama bin Laden was waiting to be interviewed. It was the first time, you write, that he was going to target a Western audience with his message that America must leave Saudi Arabia and the Holy Land. Now that you say he's one of the few people who it can be truly said changed world history, what stands out from being face-to-face with him that didn't seem important at the time, but does now with the hindsight of 9/11?
Well, that is a very good question. A kind of minor reply to that is, he mentioned something in that interview which I had no idea what he was talking about. He said, his big theme in the interview was America's a paper tiger, we're as weak as the former Soviet Union. And this, of course, was his theory of the case on 9/11. But he mentioned in passing Aden, and I never understood what the hell he was talking about. And Aden, of course, is where the USS Cole was blown up 3 years in the future. But what he was referring to, and I only realized what he was referring to years later, was Al-Qaeda's first attempt to attack American targets actually took place in December of 1992. And people associated with Al-Qaeda tried to blow up American servicemen who were billeted in hotels in Aden on their way to Somalia for Operation Restore Hope, which was the George W. Bush administration's humanitarian mission to feed starving Somalis. The bombs blew up, did not kill any U.S. servicemen, did kill a tourist and I think a hotel worker. But, they got absolutely so for him, and then the U.S. military stopped using Aden as a transit point to Somalia as a result of that attack. Anyway, I just, you asked me what did I learn later about this interview? That was a big one, which is that for bin Laden, the U.S. retreat from Aden, which didn't register, there were simply no news stories about. If you look on Nexus, you can find, a wire story or two about the attack on these hotels, but it didn't register at all in the United States but for him, it was evidence of the weakness of the United States, which was his. And so, going back to that interview, his main view was the United States was weak. We now know for a fact that he only spent 2 weeks in the United States. You can't really claim great expertise on the United States after a 2 or 3 week trip. And in a way, I think that he really didn't understand Americans or the United States because he somehow thought that he'd attack us on 9/11 and somehow we would fold our tents and leave the Middle East, which didn't happen.
Yeah, and he kind of used that attack as the one you mentioned in 1991 as proof that the U.S. would fold. And I did read that passage in your book, and I was wondering if you'd bring that up. Very interesting. Since the book is called The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden, where was he on his arc? I would assume you would consider that part of the rise, that he felt he needed to allow this interview with you in 1997.
Well, I think they were looking to do an interview with a major American, they told me that they were interested in doing a TV interview, CNN, 60 Minutes, or the BBC, is I think what, and their knowledge of the media in general was, they didn't really understand, they were like, are you agents of the CIA? Will you give this guy a fair shake? They asked some pretty basic questions because, of course, they came out of authoritarian states where there isn't a free press. And and they were also very trepidatious about the whole thing. But yeah, they had declared war on the United States in Al-Quds al-Arabi, which was then one of the few independent Arabic language news outlets not controlled by the Saudis. And, it just, no one really paid any attention. No one really paid attention really to our CNN interview, to be honest. I mean, as far as the world was concerned, and even as we didn't understand that they'd already tried to attack American troops in Somalia and Aden. So at the time, it seemed like he was declaring war on the United States, but it was sort of, how real was this call to arms wasn't clear. And so the CNN interview didn't get much attention really, because it didn't appear that he had done anything as yet.
Yeah, it's like, who's ever going to sit there and think to themselves that just 4 years later, something so crazy would happen? Take us back to the beginning. The bin Ladens are a large family. They've got many tentacles because of the practice of polygamy among some of its members. And they're a rags to riches story that you describe in this book. It took his father from Yemen to Saudi Arabia. How did his dad become connected with the royals and then with the money that the family made?
There was good timing. The bin Laden's father, who had 54 other, half siblings, in addition to bin Laden himself, left Hadramaut, which I visited before 9/11. Hadramaut is an astonishingly beautiful place, mired in the Middle Ages still today. So you can imagine what it was like in 1930 when bin Laden's father left. Mm-hmm. Basically, if you're a male in Hadramaut in Yemen, you had, very few options. Most of the men would go to Malaysia, Indonesia, go to Egypt, often, immigrate permanently or go there for 20 years because of no work. So Muhammad left for what became the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. So he had very good timing, and he was the Hadramis are builders of genius. I don't know if you've ever seen these pictures of them, but the Hadramaut medieval fortresses rise up 15 stories. So they're kind of it's a place where there's a lot of very good builders, and Mohammed bin Laden was one of those builders. He was a bricklayer, and he came and he first job was as a porter in the holy city of in Jeddah for pilgrims going to Mecca. And somehow, he set up his own business, and very soon he was attending the king's weekly majlis, which was open to the public, and you would come and, petition the king or air your grievances, and the king would solve them. And he was a pretty assiduous attender to these. And over time, he first of all got the contract to rebuild Mecca and Medina, which was not only very lucrative, but it was also very prestigious because these are the two holiest sites in Islam. He then built a road that some British contractor in 1958 had failed to build, connecting, I think, Jeddah and Mecca. Then he built the road to Taif, which made him a sort of national hero. And then he was killed in a plane crash in 1967. Interestingly, the plane was piloted by an American pilot.
Yeah, I made a note on that. Yeah.
Yeah. And his older brother died in a plane crash in the United States, and 2 decades later. But anyway, so the plane, this I think is obviously, I try not to get into too much armchair psychologizing in the book. And
that was my next question. I was going to ask you to do that, but go ahead.
Well, no, because what I wanted to do was let the reader, he or she, sort of make their own conclusions without me just trying to overly like signal all the conclusions that because at the end of the day, you still really don't know exactly why somebody does what they do. But clearly the death of his father, according to bin Laden himself, had a big impact on him. He's in this family diary that was recovered in a Abbottabad compound, was one of the key documents I used for the book. He talks about how the death of his father turned him to the study of the Quran. Now, his father died when he was 10. So at age 10, he suddenly becomes more religious. By the time he's a teenager, he memorized much of the Quran or all of the Quran. He's
Which is an
really,
unbelievable feat. I mean, by the way.
it's a huge feat. But I have a friend, Greg Barker, who made a brilliant film about these kids that learn the entire Quran. And I think there's a contest in Cairo maybe every year, and they come from around the Muslim world. And these kids are age 10. So by the time you're 10, but it's a huge feat of memory. It's 6,000 verses. And so it's not inconceivable that bin Laden, age 11 or 12, who was essentially living by him. He was an only child of this union, and kind of a solitary guy at this time. And anyway, so he learns the Quran probably, completely, and then he becomes sort of a religious zealot as a teenager, and chanting religious songs about Palestine with his buddies, and fasting twice a week and praying in the middle of the night an extra set of prayers. And he's unusual even by the standards of conservative Saudi society, this religiosity he has.
I guess I hesitate now to ask you the armchair psychology question, but I'm going to ask it. I always thought, even before I read your book, that it was interesting that his family was in the business of building things, that he was in the business of destroying things. That contrast to me is interesting. And in your book, you say he had only a few actual discussions with his dad. He eventually leaves Osama bin Laden's mother. Can we psychoanalyze those two facts at all and say this was a man who subconsciously both hated his dad and wanted to symbolically destroy things that his dad had built?
Well, I don't know, but it is a fact that his parents divorced when he was 2. Clearly, that would have an impact on any child. As you said, he only had 5 meetings with his dad, it appears, and only one was a substantive one-on-one meeting. So he had a very distant relationship with his father, but took it badly when his father was killed in this plane crash. So that all has to have an impact on you. But one of the themes of the book, I think, is that none of this was inevitable, and this was not a case of like somebody sitting down at their computer and reading ISIS propaganda and then within 6 months trying to carry out a terrorist attack. This was a process of radicalization that took decades. And, the shy religious teenager who sort of founded Al-Qaeda age 31, there were some intervening steps along the way. And even when Al-Qaeda was founded, it wasn't necessarily a group that was dedicated to killing American civilians. That also took at least 2 or 3 years to kind of formalize. So, all we can say is the death of a parent, the divorce of your parents, all that has an impact. But does it take you to the founding of Al-Qaeda? I don't think so. And the interesting thing is, this is actually one of those almost perfect sociological kind of experiments, because you have 54 siblings who essentially had the same, their life experiences were not, each of them were different in the sense they had different mothers, and some of the mothers were close to the father and may have been seen as more part of the family. But the point is when you've got 54 siblings and none of them go down your path, it's an interesting controlled experiment about like the nature versus nurture kind of question. I
guess it's fair to call him a rotten apple. The group of the
54. Well, rotten apple again. Well, look. The other thing is, if you encountered Hitler in a beer hall in Munich in the early 1920s, he would have just seemed like a deranged World War I veteran, spouting a bunch of bullshit, and of no consequence, right?
Yeah.
So, it is the kind of interplay between the person and the historical circumstances that I do believe in. Since we're talking about history, I do believe in the great man theory of history when it comes to Hitler, Napoleon, Osama bin Laden. Now, obviously, bin Laden didn't change the history of the world like Napoleon did or Hitler did, but he did change the course of foreign policy in the United States for 2 decades, and as a result of which he reshaped inadvertently the Middle East in ways that he certainly didn't expect, and also we had no idea it was going to happen. I think he that's one of the reasons I wrote another book really focusing on him, was this is the fact that there were all these unexpected consequences of the choices he made that he was unaware of at the time he made them.
Let's say a word about his mother, too. You emphasized this in the book, and I thought it was interesting. He called his mother a concubine, and you actually rewrote the word, the next sentence, to emphasize what the word concubine means.
Yeah.
What a stark thing that is. So what place does she hold when we look back and we see that he's willing to treat other women in much the same way that as the name he derisively called her?
Well, I mean, I don't know if he was being derisive about her. I think he was being
factual.
Yeah, and also, like, he did not admire the way his father had treated not only his own mother but his other wives. I mean, he had long discussions with his best friend at university and his brother-in-law about the correct way to sort of have 4 wives, and the correct way was not to, divorce number 3 and 4 on a routine basis as his dad did, which so dad had at least 20 wives. So in his mind, he was treating his wives, in the right Quranically sanctioned way, and his father had not. And I'm sure that was as a result of his father essentially treating his mother as a concubine. They were married for 2 years. They had Osama bin Laden, and he moved straight on. And she was a teenager when bin Laden's dad married bin Laden's mother. He was already a 50-year-old man, and she was, variously, 15 or 16. So it was not, the other interesting thing about I followed bin Laden's story for a long time. And the last time I wrote a book about it was about him in any detail was Manhunt, which is the story of the hunt for bin Laden. But since then, so many things have come out that are useful to know, not least that we now have confirmation of something that I always thought was true, which is bin Laden's mother was an Alawite. Now, we'd always thought that was the case because she comes from Latakia, which is an Alawite city in Syria. But Martin Chulov of The Guardian did a really interesting interview with her in 2018, in which she said, yes, I'm an Alawite, which is, if you think about Alawites, it's not clear what they believe. It's a heretical form of Shiism, even if you're a sort of mainstream Shia, because they celebrate Islamic and Christian holidays. What they precisely believe is sort of a secret. It's not really clear. And so it's a minority within a minority. So think about it if you're an Alawite in the conservative Saudi Arabia, Wahhabi, this is a very Shiism is heretical for these guys. So Alawism is even, so again, I can't armchair psychologize this entirely, but bin Laden's mother is an Alawite, which made him a sort of outsider, sort of from a religious perspective. And then, of course, his family's from Yemen, which makes him an outsider from a Saudi perspective, because you're never really going to be the Najdis and who make up the Saudi royal family. You're always going to be an outsider from Yemen. So he was sort of, he was sort of an outsider in his own family because his mother was only briefly married to his father. She was clearly one of the less significant wives. So he had this sort of triple outsiderness that you see, Stalin was from Georgia, Hitler's from Austria. Again, you don't want to compare these people.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that, he became more Catholic than the Pope in a sense.
And many presidents viewed themselves as outsiders growing up too.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Donald Trump saw himself as an outsider, even though he's the son of in many ways, he's very much part of the elite. So, but this outsiderishness might explain why bin Laden, kind of became so religiously devout. But again, you can't separate out any of these factors as being the one determinative factor.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
There's a name that comes up often in the books on terrorism and on the founding of Al-Qaeda and on Islamic fundamentalism that turns violent, jihadis. The name is Abdullah Azzam, and he effectively became Osama bin Laden's mentor in jihad.
Yeah.
His name is largely forgotten to most Americans, if not to most people around the world. Who is Abdullah Azzam, and explain how they meet and how critical this became in Osama bin Laden's formation as a jihadi?
Well, I think, again, not to be an armchair psychologist, it's easier to do it when you're talking about the book than writing about the book. But, bin Laden's father disappears when he's 10, gets killed, dies in his plane crash. And Abdullah Azzam would have been a quite effective father figure for bin Laden, who moved to Pakistan when he was in his early 20s to support the Afghan jihad against the Soviets. And Abdullah Azzam was a lot of things that bin Laden wasn't. He was a brilliant public speaker. He was a poet. He was fighting on the front lines. He'd been involved in fighting the Israelis during the 1967 war. He's a Palestinian from Jenin who went to Jordan and joined a kind of guerrilla group. And, he's kind of the man of action and the man of letters. He wrote, many, many books. He was a very charismatic guy. He created the first global jihadist movement really through the force of his own writing and force of personality, recruiting people with his books, with his articles, with his fatwas. He's a true religious scholar. He is a graduate of Al-Azhar University, which is the kind of Vatican of Sunni thought. And so for bin Laden was sort of blown away by Azzam in the early days and was basically kind of his acolyte and very quiet in his presence. And there's a wonderful, relatively new book by Thomas Hegghammer, who's a Norwegian scholar, one of the leading scholars of Islamism in the world, which is a full-scale biography of Azzam for anybody who might be interested. But yeah, Azzam had a big impact on bin Laden and the whole global jihadi movement. But Azzam eventually was assassinated by unknown assailants, and I think that there were people in bin Laden's circle, but not bin Laden himself. And he was assassinated, I think, although the crime has never been solved. He was assassinated in 1989 in Peshawar in Pakistan. But I think he was assassinated by people who basically objected to the fact that Azzam wasn't militant enough, didn't want to overthrow the existing authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. Azzam's view of jihad was a more narrow view, which is it's about pushing non-Muslim invaders out of Muslim lands, whether that's Palestine, whether that's Afghanistan. He didn't, or places like Chechnya where the Russians, he was killed by the time the Russians went in. But that's a kind of traditional concept of jihad for the jihadists. The people around bin Laden wanted to overthrow the Egyptian government, and then bin Laden himself went even a step further, which was his analysis was, let's take on the United States, because without the United States, these authoritarian governments wouldn't be able to survive.
As you describe in the book, the story of Osama bin Laden's time in Afghanistan during the war with the Soviets is critical in how he develops as a voice and as a leader of men. He learns strategy. He learns how to cultivate the idea of himself as a larger-than-life figure. And he learns propaganda. They even open up a magazine while he's there. So explain the impact of his time in Afghanistan in more detail, and just what we need to know about how we can kind of glean his roots as a leader there.
Yeah, well, that's a very good. I mean, this is I think a huge inflection point, and it goes on for years and years and years, because he goes to, within 2 weeks of the Soviet invasion, which was over Christmas 1979. He's in Pakistan. He's raising money. He's giving money to the Afghan jihad groups or people who support them. He does that for 4 years. He goes into Afghanistan for the first time in '84. It's a very transformational experience. he hadn't gone in before because his friends and family, and maybe even himself, this was a very dangerous war. The Soviets had total air superiority until 1986. They killed at least 1 million Afghans. The population of Afghanistan at the time was, maybe 18 million or something. They killed at least 1 million Afghans. They made 6 million of them leave their homes. Many of them ended up as refugees in Pakistan or Iran. They're now those families are still in Iran and Pakistan in some cases. So, bin Laden went in and was tremendously excited about what he saw, and then he started recruiting people to come to fight inside Afghanistan. He set up his own base at a place called Jaji in eastern Afghanistan. The base was called Al-Qaeda, the base in Arabic. And from Al-Qaeda, the base against the Soviets became this organization. It was sort of a nickname for the base. And then the base, like a lot of nicknames, it became the name of the organization. And bin Laden fought the Soviets himself quite bravely. He had no military expertise, and he tended to make military mistakes. So but for the people like bin Laden and people around him, they didn't care about making military mistakes. They were seeking death, and usually, death seeking is not a smart approach to military strategy, right? Intentional death seeking. But bin Laden wanted, in the 20-year-old university students he was recruiting from Saudi cities like Medina, they were seeking death and they hoped to be martyrs. But bin Laden certainly became a leader of men in this period, began to have faith in his own leadership abilities. You mentioned Jihad magazine, the propaganda arm, that starts up. Bin Laden funds it. Bin Laden appears in its pages, although not a huge amount compared to Abdullah Razam, who we just discussed. And then Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist who was killed by Saudi officials in the Istanbul consulate in 2018.
Yeah, it was hard to read his name in your book. It comes up a few times, and I felt sad reading it.
Yeah, I mean, it was very sad. I didn't know Jamal well, but I certainly admired him and got to know him in the course of the reporting on bin Laden, and then got to know a bit better, just reporting on the Saudis. And, very, very decent, thoughtful, serious person. And so Jamal, like bin Laden, Jamal Khashoggi's uncle was Adnan Khashoggi, who was a multi-billionaire. And so Khashoggi and bin Laden came from the same kind of social milieu, the kind of upper class Saudis, highly educated. They both were part of the Muslim Brotherhood. Jamal, believed in the fight against the Soviet. He clearly believed in it as a cause, and he went and he did a major piece about bin Laden, which came out in 1988, and that really put bin Laden on the map. It was a piece that appeared in Arab News, which is the main English language newspaper in Saudi, and also in Al-Sharq al-Awsat, which is a big Saudi newspaper. And, it was the piece was completely factually accurate. It was, I think, somewhat flattering to bin Laden and the people who were around him. No members of the Saudi royal family, of which there was a huge number, were fighting the Soviets personally. And of course, this was a war in which the United States was also aligned with the Afghans against the Soviets. So that, I think, put bin Laden on the map, and he suddenly became something of a war hero, which made him a desirable figure to come and speak at mosques or at social gatherings. He began to become more of a public speaker. Suddenly, he was also something of a catch on the marriage market, because even though he was already married, the two wives that would play an important role going forward married him in part because he was a jihadi war hero. Both of them had PhDs. One was a child psychiatrist. The other one had a PhD in Quranic grammar. And they knew, bin Laden had married when he was 17. His wife was 15. They had 11 kids together. His first wife, a Syrian cousin. But he sort of became a national figure as a result of his, kind of heroics on the Afghan war front. Although it is worth pointing out that, the bin Laden and his men had no effect on the war. They were very small in number. The Afghans had, a minimum of 175,000 men on the battlefield at any time, up to 250,000. Afghans don't really need much help about fighting, particularly from a bunch of, rich Saudis who, don't. I mean, they just it was bin Laden in his own mind thought he had helped defeat the Soviets. That was delusional thinking of the higher.
Inflated. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to gloss over too much of the 1990s because there's this kind of rising tide of violence that we see from Al Qaeda. There are a number of attacks. Some of them we've heard of, some of them, honestly, we may have forgotten. But of course, Nairobi and a couple of embassy bombings, and then it leads up to the Cole bombing in 2000. I guess the way I want to just have you cover that time period is, what is the thesis that he's building about the United States, and how did that thesis fit into this religious dream that he had of a Muslim world?
Well, I think bin Laden was never very clear about his preferred end state. And he never talked in great detail about it, but I'm presuming it would be Taliban-style theocracies from Indonesia to Morocco is basically what it looked like. And he thought that the United States was standing in the way of this dream because of its support for regimes like the Saudis and the Egyptians. And his theory of the case was, you apply enough military pressure to the United States, they pull out of the Middle East. He was very influenced by the 1983 Marine barracks attack by Hezbollah, which resulted in the Reagan administration yanking troops out of Lebanon. He was very influenced by the Somalia Black Hawk Down incident, where the Clinton administration pulled out troops after 18 American servicemen were killed in the Black Hawk Down incident. And that was the model. The model was, attack the American targets in Africa and the Middle East, eventually in the United States, and the United States would change its foreign policy. That model, of course, made no sense at all, and backfired completely, because in the end, bin Laden achieved precisely the opposite of what he was trying to do. Was the United States became more involved in the Middle East and more tightly aligned with a lot of the regimes he didn't like as a result of 9/11. And so it backfired.
And there was this idea that the Bush administration pushed, which was that they did this because they hate freedom. But there were very specific policy ends that they were trying to achieve. This was not, at least in Al Qaeda's thinking, an attack on freedom itself. They had specific goals.
Yeah, I mean, bin Laden himself responded to that line, in I think 3 years after 9/11. He said, look, if it was about freedom, why didn't we attack Sweden? Which was an interesting choice of country, because we know that at least 23 of his siblings went on vacation to Sweden in 1971. And he himself may have been part of that. There's some debate about it. The point is like, he didn't select Sweden out of nowhere. Of course, Sweden is a very liberal democracy, but he's kind of joking about it. Like, if it was really about freedom, why didn't we attack Sweden? So his critique of the United States, which he told us in '97, told John Miller of ABC News in '98, and then wrote hundreds of thousands of words about it, and it was very, very, very consistent, which is it's about American foreign policy in the Middle East. Principally, it's support for the Saudis. Secondarily, it's support for Israel. And, much further down the list, issues like Egypt. But the key point was American support for the Saudi royal family.
I don't know that we need to go into great detail of 9/11. It's very painful, and we've had the 20-year anniversary this year. But I guess I would just ask you to cover 9/11 by just explaining how it was conceived and how closely to the conception the reality wound up being. In other words, was what we saw happen that day planned in a cave by Osama bin Laden, or was it, was some of it kind of farmed out and this is what they wound up with?
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of long prehistory here, but it first percolated as sort of a completely notional idea in the Philippines in 1995, when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander, and his nephew Ramzi Youssef, who bombed the Trade Center the first time in February of '93, and a guy called Murad was sort of just like knocking around ideas. One of which was to fly a small plane into the CIA headquarters. And then it developed from that into, maybe also bringing down American airliners with bombs in the Middle East, in Asia, a dozen of them. that became the sort of kernel of the 9/11 plot, which KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, talked to bin Laden about in 96. Bin Laden himself made a number of adjustments to the plot, cut out the Asia part. He said it was too complicated, and really focused on and chose the targets. He kept this all very close hold. The only people who really knew about the plot is Mohammed Atef, who was the number 2 in Al-Qaeda at the time, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander, bin Laden, later in the game, the lead hijackers like Mohammed Atta. Even most of the hijackers themselves had no idea what the targets were, so it was very compartmented. One of the kind of interesting takeaways about the book, at least for me, having spent 2.5 decades working on the subject, there's been a lot of inflation of the role of Zawahiri in all this, who's the Egyptian leader of Al-Qaeda today, a very bright guy, a surgeon from an upper-class Egyptian family. After 9/11, there was a lot of narrative that he was the brains of Al-Qaeda. Actually, that's completely untrue. Bin Laden really ran the show. Zawahiri was a very marginal player in Al-Qaeda before 9/11. A lot of people sort of have forgotten this fact, but he was actually jailed for a period of several months in the run-up to 9/11 in Dagestan. He was penniless. He had a tiny organization, almost no followers. He's not a charismatic guy. People don't particularly like him. And so for bin Laden, Zawahiri was convenient window dressing, because when bin Laden declared his global Islamic front, he needed people from other groups. And Zawahiri was a convenient Egyptian. And so he shows up in pictures of the organization when it first declared itself in 98. But Zawahiri, and the big point here is that Zawahiri was focused on overthrowing the Egyptian regime. Bin Laden could have cared less about it. An academic somewhere did a textual analysis of all bin Laden's statements, and I think Egypt turned out to be number 36 on a list where number 1 was US, number 2 was Saudi Arabia. So on the hierarchy of bin Laden's concerns, Zawahiri's concerns were 0. And Zawahiri didn't influence bin Laden on his key strategic decision, which was attack the United States. If Al-Qaeda had kind of kept a narrow focus on trying to overthrow through a coup or through an assassination attempt, an authoritarian Middle Eastern regime, the group might still be, somewhat, in a different place. I mean, it chose the wrong enemy. Strategically, it was the wrong decision. The enemy reacted in ways that bin Laden had no expectation was the reaction that was going to happen. And as a result of which, Al-Qaeda was, largely destroyed in the years after 9/11.
Yeah, it was like his greatest success led to the downfall itself.
Yeah.
I remember I guess it was 2002 probably. So I was already a year into college, but I went to Cooperstown, New York with some high school friends to see the Baseball Hall of Fame. Amazing tourist site, one of the most beautiful places you can visit in the United States. And I remember we were sitting in this hotel room, and, I guess young kids kind of fantasize about stuff. And we said to ourselves, what if Osama bin Laden is near us right now? What if this is where he's hiding? And to me, I tell that story because it shows the psychological hold that this figure suddenly had on those of us in the United States who were devastated and horrified by the attacks of 9/11. Did he enjoy playing that role of being the psychological sort of foil for the United States, even though he ends up failing to produce any significant future attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think he referred to it himself in his public statement. I think he said, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said at one point, a few years after 9/11, all it takes is a couple of guys waving the flag of jihad and the United States sort of freaks out. So he certainly understood the power of psychological warfare. And I think he wanted to, the point of terrorism is to terrorize. And so it's interesting what you were saying about the role that he played psychologically, because I think, over time that simply decayed. And when he was killed, really, I think, he almost disappeared as a figure. He didn't live on as some heroic martyrdom figure. He didn't die on a field of jihad. He died surrounded by his wives and kids.
Do today's terrorists look up to him as a mythical figure?
It's an interesting question. ISIS and Al Qaeda are in a kind of a dispute. I mean, fairly heated dispute, which I think if bin Laden was alive, he might have been able to kind of keep it all together. But ISIS still regards him as sort of an important figure, and I think he's but I think over time he's just sort of receded, and he didn't achieve the things he wanted, but he certainly, if you look at the history of jihad, he's the biggest figure. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi the leader of ISIS that President Trump killed with a drone strike, will become a trivial pursuit question, I think, before Osama bin Laden becomes a trivial pursuit question. But there will come a time when Osama bin Laden will be a trivial pursuit question too. I'm not saying it's anytime soon, but I end the book with a scene where Gina Bennett, who wrote the first warning about bin Laden, she's still at the CIA today. She wrote this warning back in 1993. But she's when the day bin Laden's killed, a 26-year-old CIA analyst, a female just like herself, who herself who wrote the first warning as a mid-20s analyst, said this is a great day, and Gina Bennett says, "Have you ever heard of the Baader-Meinhof gang?" And the analyst says no. And of course, the Baader-Meinhof gang had a huge profile in the 70s when they were killing German officials and businessmen and even Americans. And Gina Bennett says, the worst day for Al-Qaeda will be when two analysts at this counterterrorism center talk to each other, and one of them doesn't really know who Osama bin Laden is. Now, obviously, there's going to be some time off, but you do feel like one of the reasons I wrote the book, Evan, was I teach at Arizona State, and I realized that the students I was teaching were either not born on 9/11 or were very young kids, were babies. Yeah. And one of them asked to me, what's the difference between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban? And, that's a very good question. but I realized for them, this event had moved into history, even though it continues to have reverberations. I mean, for me, the Korean War is an historical event, which doesn't really have many reverberations today. 9/11 is a historical event, which I think, the aftershocks of which we're still feeling. But nonetheless, for them, it's not an event in memory as it is for me, and I presume for you.
Yeah. I've done stories about people who are now even older than they were when I first did the stories, but their first memories were of 9/11.
Right.
And now I can probably do stories for my TV station for people who were not even alive and who are learning about it in school for the first time. I want to ask you about, you actually took a tour of the compound in Pakistan. So what did you glean from that tour? This is the place, of course, where he was killed in 2011 in the strike by the Navy SEALs. What did you learn from taking that tour about how he lived on a day-to-day basis there? It was interesting in your introduction, you talk about how he was worried at the time that history was passing him by, but describe life in that compound.
Well, so his life was very circumscribed, and that was also of his family. I mean, he had a lot on his mind in his last several weeks of life. The bodyguards that were protecting him were going to leave him, which was a real conundrum because they did everything for him, from getting groceries to moving messages around, and they were fed up with protecting the world's most wanted men, and they were concerned about the dangers and the low pay that bin Laden was paying them, and they were right to be concerned because both of them were killed in the raid, and one of their wives, by the SEALs. But they were preparing to leave him, and bin Laden, he was there. There were 27 people on the compound, 16 in bin Laden's family, 11 in the bodyguard's family, and they were growing their own crops. They had cows. They had chickens, they were growing as much stuff as possible so they didn't need to go out, because, it's not simply that, if you're buying food for 27 people and there are only 11 people appear to be living in a place, somebody may notice over time. So they were being pretty careful about everything, and there was no phone service, no internet service. Bin Laden, bin Laden's two oldest wives with PhDs were helping him. He, as you say, thought that history is passing him by. The Arab Spring was happening. It was a big deal. He thought it was the most important event in the Middle East in centuries, yet his ideas, his followers were absent. his family were very kind of concerned that he hadn't made a public statement. He was very, very reliant on his two oldest wives, interestingly, to write these statements. He was kind of bouncing ideas off them. Two of his wives had been with him on the run for a long time. His oldest wife joined him on February 15th, 2011. She'd been living under house arrest in Iran. He was tremendously excited to see her again. She was 8 years older than him, very committed to jihad, knew the Quran well, PhD in child psychology, claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad, which was, of course, a big deal for bin Laden, who tried to model himself on the Prophet Muhammad, at least in his own mind. And, so the life and, based on what I saw at the compound, they were, not living large. Bin Laden had always lived, even though he's had a lot of money in the bank until the mid-90s, before his family cut him off, before the Saudis kind of, cut off his money supplies. He always lived a very ascetic life. He didn't, he partly because of his religious beliefs. Of course, there were no pictures, no music, but also, he lived like a peasant, a medieval peasant. He seemed to enjoy inflicting this on his family, some of whom left because of this. One of his wives left him in Sudan with 3 children, saying, essentially, I didn't sign up for this life of living like a pauper and this life of jihad, and she left, and his oldest son also left him.
At the compound, I picture, sorry to cut you off, but I picture a mixture of linoleum floors and dirt floors. Which is it?
Yeah. I mean, the color scheme was gray. There's no paint on the wall. It was all very dingy. And that all fits with bin Laden. He didn't care about those things. He never, even when he was, first fixing up a house with his wife, when he was 17, he just didn't care about those kinds of worldly things. That was one of the sort of attractions for his followers, that he was living this sort of very ascetic life. And the compound was, the beds were sort of very rudimentary. And then I walked up. There was a staircase, and there was a huge yellow metal door that was blocking the staircase from the ground floor up to the second and third floors. And of course, who puts a huge metal gate on their ground floor? So when the SEALs came in, that was one of the signals to them that they were in the right place, because you wouldn't put a giant metal gate on the ground floor of your house to prevent access to your second and third floor, typically.
Right. Typically. What was it like for you knowing in 1997 when you met him, you couldn't have known what was going to happen? What was it like to suddenly you weren't in his presence because he was already gone and into the ocean, but what was it like to sit there and know that this man who had done all these things was living in the place that you were just walking around and touring? And
I expected a sort of frisson, like, visiting Hitler's bunker at the end of after the end of World War II, and it didn't happen for me. I was with the Pakistani military intelligence, ISI. They were like, I couldn't take photographs. There was a armed army captain and my guide from the ISI, who's a relatively senior officer. And I was just really focused on trying to get as much information visually about how the family were living and what happened the night of the raid. And I didn't have a lot of time to sort of think to myself, wow, amazing, or anything like that. I went up into the room where he was killed. The ceiling was very low for somebody as tall as he. I saw it was one of these really sort of very cheap white kind of, I don't know what sort of cardboard filler type ceilings, and I could see this sort of black spatter of what I consumed was congealed blood, where kind of a bullet had entered his head, and bits of his brain had splattered on the ceiling. But that setup was very rudimentary. He had one of those squat toilets where which are very typical in Pakistan, where you kind of squat on 2 footprints, and he had some just for men hair dye. He was dyeing his hair.
What what is the future of terrorism by jihadis in the United States? You know, when 9/11 happened, it was
Yeah.
almost like we were assuming that this was going to keep happening time and again. Right now, white supremacists are the ones getting the ink in the United States these
Yeah.
days. Where is the threat right now among the jihadis? We haven't, I don't want to say it this way, but we haven't heard from them in a long time.
Well, we haven't. I mean, they haven't gone away entirely. There was the attack on Pensacola Air Base, killing um, three U.S. sailors in December of 2019 by a Saudi military officer who was in touch with Al Qaeda in Yemen. But yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, this threat has receded. I think it may kind of come back a little bit, not as attacks from outside the United States, but jihadi groups in Afghanistan are celebrating their great victory. And I think if you have these ideas in the United States, the Taliban victory and is something that may influence you, particularly if either the Taliban or people associated with the Taliban or jihadi groups in Afghanistan start calling for attacks in the West, which is what ISIS did when they established their caliphate. The attacks in the West that are attributable to people inspired by ISIS dropped off the chart. I mean, there were a lot of them when ISIS was at its height in 2015. And as ISIS began having battlefield after battlefield defeat, those ISIS-inspired attacks began to go down. And now they have almost ceased. They haven't stopped entirely. There was an attack in Manhattan, you may recall, early on in the Halloween 2017. There was an attack by an Uzbek American who was inspired by ISIS. He drove a car into bicyclists and pedestrians in Manhattan.
Yeah.
So that was after the ISIS caliphate had gone away. It was at Halloween 2018. That was after the ISIS caliphate had basically been defeated. But that's the exception that proves the rule. So yeah, you're right. White extremists have always been an issue from a terrorism perspective. I mean, Oklahoma City killed 168 Americans in 1995, and that threat is increasing. And that I wrote a book that we were United States of Jihad, and it was based on at that time I think 330 Americans. Now there are about 500 who've been charged with jihadist crimes since 9/11, ranging from the innocuous to the relatively innocuous to the very serious. What's interesting to me, Evan, is that those guys swam, and they're almost entirely guys. Those guys swam in a relatively small kind of ocean of people who thought they were doing the right thing. There might have been 10,000 Americans who subscribed to these views, or I'm making the number up. But you look at the white nationalist movement, you look at polling data about QAnon, you look at the polling data about Republicans prepared to do violence to restore Trump to power. You're talking about millions of people who have either crazy conspiratorial ideas or ideas that violence in the service of politics is fine. And that's a big difference from the jihadists and the right-wing extremist movement, which is that there are the ocean of sympathizers is much, much larger in this country, which I think has implications for potential scale of violence. Law enforcement is obviously very focused on this issue, so that's a good thing. But the pool of sympathizers is not insubstantial.
This was a question that was asked a lot after 9/11, and I'd be curious to ask it now. What is the best way for all of us to thumb our noses, just based on what you've known, what you've learned about jihadi terrorism? What is and also about their goals for what they wanted to inflict on American society? What is the best way for all of us to thumb our noses at bin Laden during our daily lives, about how we live our lives and how we treat each other, and say, we're not going to let you have the world you imagined when you launched these attacks?
I think you just answered it, which is we're not going to let you have the world you imagined. And, part of that is we're not going to like freak out.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of that after 9/11. We're not, we understand this is a threat, but it's not as existential. And that was true, shortly after 9/11. It was a threat, but it wasn't existential. And we've had COVID is about to kill 800,000 people. So, there are, you know, a couple 100,000 of those deaths might have been avoidable by different policy prescriptions. So there are plenty of other things for people to be concerned about. And I think, to a large degree, terrorism is people's concerns about terrorism are unsurprisingly directly related to what is actually happening. So when you go back to the 2015, 2016 time, there was the Orlando attack that killed 49 people. There was the San Bernardino attack that killed 14. Americans were very concerned that they or a member of their family might get killed by an ISIS-inspired terrorist. And when that threat subsided, the Americans tuned out the issue. So it's also very driven by kind of what's actually happening, which makes sense because that's how human beings think. I mean, if there was an attack tomorrow by a terrorist group or right-wing extremists, jihadist terrorists that killed dozens of people, this again would become a subject of real public interest. But I think for now, it's mostly in the background when it comes to jihadi terrorism. But it can change in 2 or 3 years' time. The jihadists have had a major victory in Afghanistan now. A jihadist kind of pro-jihadist regime is now in place. Siraj Haqqani, who's the Minister of Interior in Afghanistan, is described by the United Nations as part of the leadership council of Al-Qaeda. So that's the first time in history where an Al-Qaeda sort of made man is essentially has a senior government job. So it's not like this thing has gone away.
Lastly, why have you devoted your life essentially at this point to telling this story? This is a difficult world, even for me to read about, let alone research and delve into in the way you have. It's a difficult, sad world to live in some ways. Why is this so important that you keep writing these books and keep on trying to explain what has happened and who is behind what has happened?
Well, like you, I'm interested in history. And the Cold War ended, and then the Trade Center was attacked in February of '93. And I didn't think about it very self-consciously, but that seemed like a big deal. And luckily I had the right kind of bosses at CNN, who let me go to Afghanistan in '93 as a very immature, guy with Peter Arnett, who was then the world's most famous war correspondent, and a couple of other people who really knew what they were doing. And we dug into the question of what was this phenomenon coming out of Afghanistan that was, because the people who bombed the Trade Center the first time around in February of '93, a number of them had trained in Afghanistan and supported the Afghan war effort. And then I went back again in '97, again with Peter Arnett, to interview bin Laden, because we thought he might be kind of the leader of all this. And, I sort of fell into it because of circumstance. He did change history. It turned out to be the right, you never really know what stories are going to be important or unimportant. You just pursue things that you think are of interest. And some of them turn out to be meaningless, and some of them turn out to be meaningful. And I first traveled to Pakistan when I was 20. I was a student at university. I made a film with 2 friends of mine about the Afghan refugees. So I've been interested in Afghanistan my entire professional life, and was lucky enough to meet the right people who I could collaborate with, or allowed me, or in some cases gave me the money for CNN. Took a risk to do all this, and I basically, there's a lot of luck that led me to this, and more than that, I can't really say.
Peter Bergen, the author of The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Check out the book and his website, which is peterbergen.com. He's on Twitter at peterbergencnn. I cannot more highly recommend his books as well, Manhunt and United States of Jihad, which were both mentioned here on the show today. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.